Plowed Under, Food Policy Protests and Performance in New Deal America, in partnership with the culinary historians of Ann Arbor.
I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for the warm welcome. Famed attorney and leader of the American Civil Liberties Union, Clarence Darrow, like so many others, thought the 1933 Agricultural Adjustment Act, what I'll call the AAA, to be immoral. How could the government pay farmers to leave fields fallow while children rummaged in trash for food and thousands of Americans stood in bread lines day after day? How could President Franklin Roosevelt actively throw away food in the face of so much want? Darrow surely knew the currency of his rhetoric. I have never heard of anything so truly absurd as helping the people by killing pigs and destroying crops. He also likely believed it, because the cultural code of conduct regarding food and the nobility of farming are so deeply ingrained in the American consciousness that the AAA seemed to flout basic human decency. At the moment when hunger's call to obligation was most insistent, when access to food was truly at stake for millions of Americans. Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace anticipated that this New Deal agricultural program would, quote, face an unfavorable public reaction. He underestimated the fervor, ubiquity, and persistence of criticism leveled at the AAA. Throughout the 1930s, citizens from across the social spectrum denounced the program as immoral. They engaged in what I'll call a theater of food in their protests to challenge the AAA. The federal government also turned to the theater of food in efforts to convince the public of the AAA's benefits. I examine the political performances and protests that the AAA sparked. I look at two cultural events, the 1933 World's Fair in Chicago and a 1936 Federal Theater Project play sponsored by the WPA called AAA Plowed Under. I also look at three distinct socioeconomic groups. All of these cases have been previously studied or historicized in an isolated fashion, isolated from each other as theater, women, consumers, African-American sharecroppers, and farmers. When I brought them together, it threw into relief the constellation of anxieties that made up the lived experiences of the 1930s agricultural crisis. It also showed me the significance of food as a political, theatrical prop. First, circumstance compelled citizens and the federal government to confront the moral tensions between food as a biological necessity and food as a vital national commercial product. On the one hand, everyone involved participated in the humanist discourse of food as a universal human right. At the same time, each group that I examine justified their right to food through the producer ethic, that deep-seated belief that a good citizen is a citizen who contributes to the nation. Indeed, not only protesters, but the federal government carefully staged their emotional and political appeals to the public. Food was a trope. This is a picture from the 1933 World's Fair, the dairy industry exhibit. And that says, dairy products build superior people. So food was a trope that articulated the demands and political identities of the various groups, and it does it in an instant. What makes ordinary food such a good prop, as you all might know, so attention-getting and symbolically resonant and potentially politically persuasive, is its ability to trigger physical desires and aversions in the same instant that it reproduces identities and social relations. USDA officials who were working on the exhibits for the 1933 World's Fair emphasized that staging an image of plenty for everyone as a result of the AAA would do political work. One official said, "By presenting facts in inspiring form, we move the public to take a certain action. This is the true function of an exhibit." In protest conflicts, protesters held out particular foods as central symbols. Now here, it's crucial for me to stress that the battles over the Agricultural Adjustment Act were not just waged for farmers' rights or consumers' rights, but, for example, the right to meat or the right to control milk. The cultural significance of these foods, and here I've listed beliefs about meat and milk. The cultural significance of these foods informed how and why citizens opposed the AAA, and how both citizens and the government conceived of consumers' rights, farmers' rights, human rights, and the government's obligations. Given Herbert Hoover's perceived inaction following the 1929 crash, Franklin Roosevelt campaigned by characterizing capitalism as an economic system that required intervention. While Republicans prayed of economic laws, men and women are starving. We must lay hold of the fact that economic laws are not made by nature. They are made by human beings. Immediately upon taking office, Roosevelt, along with Congress, began tinkering with industrial and agricultural markets in efforts to restore the economy and set up programs to provide immediate relief to the unemployed. One of these programs, of course, was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, passed in May 1933. The AAA's primary aim was to ease farmers' desperate circumstances by raising the prices of agricultural products to align them with the cost of production. In essence, the federal government would pay farmers to produce less by removing acreage from cultivation or raising less livestock, thus decreasing the amount of food commodities on the market. A tax was then levied against corporate food processors to fund the federal subsidies that would go to the farmers to take the acreage out of cultivation. The USDA anticipated that a decrease in available commodities would increase demand, which would in turn increase both the market price of the agricultural products and farmers' purchasing power. The AAA was designed to work in conjunction with other programs to boost employment, industry, and consumers' purchasing power. But despite its intentions, the AAA encountered controversy from the start. Unlike other industry, agriculture supplied products that Americans could not do without. The AAA was disdained as a policy of scarcity amid want. And while farmers thought it counter to their moral duty as the nation's providers, consumers claimed that it caused unnatural inflation of food prices. In opposition to the AAA, John Simpson, head of the very prominent Farmers Union, testified against it before the U.S. Senate that, quote, "Farmers are not producing too much. We need all this. What we have overproduction of is empty stomachs and bare backs." So here's just an outline of what the act was intended to do: to restore agricultural prices, decrease the supply because buyers are buying it way under the cost of production, and the government promised to limit any increases that the consumers would see through this tax that they were having the corporate processors pay. That's the response. The Chicago World's Fair. 1933 1934. It opened just a couple of weeks after passage of the AAA, which was already embroiled in controversy. And it provided an opportunity for the Roosevelt administration to sell the policy. The USDA exhibits displayed an America restored to social and economic stability, and visitors responded. Exhibits featuring food items were some of the most engaging to the audiences. Upon entering the exhibit, fairgoers encountered this semicircular alcove that served as an informal meeting place where they could speak with docents about the USDA's work and peruse various pamphlets. In May 1933, the installation was just that curved wall with the signs and then some photographs. And Wallace, Henry Wallace, above the original installation, this is the 1934, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Above the original installation was Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture, saying, "Science has conquered the fear of famine and has created abundance. And now we need to learn to live with abundance." These words are pointing to an ominous underside of bounty, well known in the visual landscape of Depression-era America. Fruit was rotting on trees. Fields were going unharvested. Farmers were burning their crops. High levels of unemployment had meant that consumers lacked money to buy goods, including food. Demand plummeted and surplus commodities piled up. Agricultural markets were glutted, and prices were so low that farmers could not afford to harvest crops and bring them to market. For the 1934 season, as you see here, there's scale pans. This was designed to bring the display further, quote, in line with the new agricultural program. The bars weighing the loads of supply and demand were labeled "Prosperity requires balanced agriculture." On the left side, a sign under the words "The Goal" elaborated the AAA's purpose, and it says, "Adjustment of agriculture to the quantity that the nation and the world will buy at a fair price, so the farmer may obtain an equitable share of the nation's income." The right side sign explained progress made and employment that was created due to the AAA. These results within the year were designed to refute the public doubts about the AAA's effectiveness. The sign also emphasized the public consumer is a major beneficiary of agricultural adjustment, opposing the arguments that farmers benefited to consumers' detriment. The scale manifests plenty as balance, the result of adjustment. And here on this side, what you see, and what you'll see throughout my presentation today, are scenes from the 1936 WPA play called AAA Plowed Under, which is the documentary play staging this agricultural crisis. And this is the scene and an image of the production encapsulating the disconnect between farmers, or the impasse reached by farmers and consumers, right? So you see farmer says, "We plow our sweat into the earth," farmer's wife, "and bring forth ripe provender. We starve. The wheat stands high in our fields. Feed us, pay us, feed us. The wheat is better destroyed. I say burn it." And then this massive silhouette comes up with the pitchfork. In the World's Fair exhibit, though, frontier-style rhetoric was deployed to envision progress and shift emphasis from problem to solution, from surplus to plenty. Another display, called "The New Trail in Agriculture," showed the adjustment program's benefits for farmers and consumers alike. In this exhibit, there were 5 life-size cutouts. There was the county agent and Mrs. Wheat Farmer, who discussed farm production, and then Mr. Wheat Farmer next to Mrs. Wheat Farmer, who gets a check from Uncle Sam, and the farmer says, "Thanks, Uncle Sam, for helping me and my neighbors get organized for production control. I'll carry out my contract with the Secretary of Agriculture." And then next to them was Mrs. City Housewife. She says, I'm glad to pay a little more for food because she knows the money benefits the producers directly and that farmers could then purchase her husband's industrial goods. She, too, could help maintain farm families by maintaining her own. These figures modeled the behavior that the USDA deemed patriotic. They were trying to teach consumers and farmers how to act like good citizens during this crisis. And the installation tried to transform an economic program into a nostalgic embodiment of the American way of life. The exhibit stimulated positive, iconic associations of the rural, including connection and closeness, family farming, community, and quality, thus suggesting that the AAA would preserve the fundamental source of American morality. By using these idyllic images of farming, the USDA countered allegations that the AAA operated to corporations' benefits. By highlighting consumer choice, exhibits countered the idea that the AAA violated consumers' rights to indispensable foods. These installations enacted, rather, a partnership or balance between the American farmer and the federal government, which emphasized preservation of the farmer's way of life to ensure plenty for all. Approximately 15 million people visited the USDA exhibits. And as a result of public interest in these agriculture and food exhibits, many of them were converted into touring exhibits and served as the basis for the display design at the 1939-1940 New York World's Fair and the 1940 San Francisco Fair, all selling the AAA. Meanwhile, the AAA threatened the livelihoods of owners of small farms by spurring the consolidation of these farms into large corporate enterprises. Many farmers faced foreclosure due in part to severely depressed prices and believed that processors would then lower the market price for agricultural products even further in order to offset that processing tax they had to pay. And they did. Additionally, farmers could not decrease production and compete with these large farms, which were buying up foreclosed land and equipment. The May 1927 issue of Newsweek was published on the same day that the Chicago World's Fair opened, and it told a very different story of agricultural adjustment. The drama unfolding before the reader is war. The Wisconsin milk pool against the state of Wisconsin and the federal government capitalized on milk's unmatched moral force as, quote, indispensable to the human race and the keystone of the food arch. During 6 days of protest, from May 13th to the 18th, 1933, the Wisconsin milk pool strike took over the eastern half of Wisconsin along Lake Michigan, from the Illinois border to the far north and west toward the middle of the state. Milk pool strikers cruised highways and flagged trucks to stop for inspection. There were trucks that were allowed to move through the picket lines through an agreement, and those trucks bore a white cross on the windshield and carried what was called public welfare milk. All other trucks were subject to attack, an act that entailed strikers jumping onto the trucks, yanking out the milk cans, and pouring the milk onto the road, smashing the cans. Armed deputies and then National Guardsmen rode in the non-striking farmers' trucks to ensure that milk would arrive at dairy corporations. The Guardsmen carried gas bombs, rifles, clubs, and bayonets. They stood guard over arrested strikers with machine guns. Visually and in bodily impact, it resonated acutely with the Great War, in which many of these dairymen had served. The governor, who was trying to act as peacekeeper, could not maintain that position. because his deployment of the National Guard against farmers was unprecedented. And here you see a battle between this is the aftermath of farmers having pulled milk off of trucks, and this is in the midst of a battle. So this is all gas. It's really grainy and hard to see, but you see people on the truck pouring it out, and there would be other images of clashes as well. That's the scene of such a strike in the middle. That, again, is from the play that I'll talk about towards the end. Guardsmen were dressed as civilians in these battles, yet the arsenal of weaponry was not lost on the public, nor was the irony of a state claiming to be neutral while deploying armed guards to secure the rights of only one side. The reality of violence against farmers and the reality of farmers destroying the nation's most important food raised the question of whether independent farming mattered to the moral standing of the nation. Indeed, dairymen's cultivation of their property constituted much of Wisconsin's economy. Milk production was inscribed in its geography and its people, and so it was its identity. While the 1933 rural landscape of Wisconsin seemed to embody American ideals, farm foreclosures and the resultant transformation of farms from family-owned into corporate businesses also suggested that the corporations were invading the preserve of American democracy. But the situation also confirmed that milk could never be seen as just another commodity. And so it questioned both producers' and consumers' rights to milk. Two pictures, it's this, right? Oh, I can't get my pointer in. This is called Two Pictures. It is a cartoon that was published on September 18th in the Chicago Daily Tribune. And it indicates the moral implications of the AAA plowed under. Chicago's reliance on Wisconsin for a sizable percentage of its fluid milk might explain the focus on the costs of the strike for consumers rather than the stakes for farmers. So this cartoon, which you can't see, so here is a very near replication of the farmers pouring the milk, and it says, "Pickets seize and dump milk after battling deputies." And then here we have a mother with 3 children, and she's very gaunt. I don't know if you can make that out. And the little girl who's tugging on her skirts is saying, "I'm hungry." So this cartoon captures the profound moral implications of dumping milk and the inability to recognize it as a good to be bought and sold like any other. This May strike brought historic justifications for engaging in war, justifications like freedom, security, and honor, to bear upon economic arguments in favor of or against the corporate takeover of U.S. agriculture through the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The timing of the AAA's passage would complicate matters even further. By May of 1933, farmers, when the act was passed, farmers had already planted their crops, and the sows were impregnated for the season. So the Agricultural Adjustment Administration undertook emergency measures to eliminate anticipated cotton and pork surpluses that would supposedly further glut the market and stall the program at the start. Yeah? So they want to plow field, they're desiring to pull acreage out of cultivation and bring less livestock to the markets. But it's already spring, yes? So even if they pull this stuff out of cultivation, there'll be no effect for another year. So they announced an emergency measure in June of 33. They were going to pay farmers, the federal government, to plow under 1/4 of all cotton planted prior to the legislation's enactment. Then in August, at the World's Fair, which is the epicenter was of American livestock trade and processing, Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace announced what was called the Corn Hog Program. The mechanisms by which this program operated alarmed consumers and farmers, rural and urban citizens alike. The mechanism was this: the slaughter of 6 million pigs and the plowing under of the corn used for feed. Then, the ends failed rather quickly. Many piglets were too small for processing machinery, and a sizable amount of livestock, instead of being made into edible products to be given to the poor, were made into inedible grease and tankage. Piglets were buried and dumped in the Mississippi River. Just over 20% of the pigs were distributed as meat. The New Deal seemingly sanctioned a grotesque waste while its citizens suffered hunger. Thus, when food prices, particularly pork and beef, escalated rapidly at the start of 1935, consumers blamed the AAA. Across the nation, women led protests against the high cost of meat. The USDA attributed the rise in prices to the 1934 drought, and indeed, it had much to do with it, but it's hard to get over the slaughter of 6 million pigs. Women were faced with an impossible situation as wives and consumers. On June 10th, 1935, as a consumers movement showed its strength in protests across the nation, Time magazine narrated a march toward women's activism. Quote, "Slowly through the winter, while the meat supply was dwindling, the price to the consumer was creeping up. By February, housewives everywhere began to complain." The cost of vegetables, fruits, and other foods had advanced during January and February, but the price of meat was predicted to soar. In March, Secretary of Agriculture Wallace tried to quell consumers' concerns by offering that the prices of food other than meat should not continue to climb. The Detroit Free Press, estimated the price escalation of meat was 62% over 3 years. Meanwhile, unemployment levels were hovering around 20% nationally in 35. 5 years of low income levels due to pervasive unemployment compounded the incredible and incredibly rapid rise of meat prices. Throughout the spring and summer of 1935, women in Los Angeles, New York City, Seattle, Cleveland, Detroit, and other urban areas protested the cost of meat. Women's groups adopted versions of the name Action Committee Against the High Cost of Living, and they coordinated protests. The Hamtramck Women's Action Committee Against the High Cost of Living began organizing in mid-July, right after the Los Angeles boycott and New York City boycott. Members elected a woman named Mary Zook as their leader. At the Hamtramck City Council meeting on July 24th, 1935, the women announced their intention to protest because, quote, "meat has become a luxury for many of our homes," end quote. At this meeting, the group presented a resolution to Mayor Joseph Lewandowski and asked that he send it to both President Roosevelt and Secretary Wallace. The resolution called for a federal investigation of meat prices to discover if corporations were passing the cost of the AAA tax on to the consumers. They were, by the way, if you didn't get that yet. On the first day of the boycott, Saturday, July 27th, 1935, the Hamtramck Women's Committee, here they are walking down the avenue, carried signs that demanded a 20% price cut on meat and urged a meat boycott. They paraded through the city's shopping district down Joseph Campo Avenue. They blocked butcher shops and the delicatessens. Early on, many of the meat markets closed up shop. The pickets also stationed themselves at the entrances of groceries to inspect shoppers' parcels upon exiting. They took any meat they found and destroyed it. In doing so, these female pickets fought with male and female shoppers. This first day of picketing resulted in an estimated loss of $65,000 in sales on Hamtramck's busiest shopping day of the week. And as you all know, lots of people would come in from the Detroit metro area into Hamtramck on Saturdays to buy meat at the Polish butchers. A week into their campaign, the Hamtramck housewives vowed to extend their battle to include milk, butter, and other staples vital to their families as soon as they won price reductions on meat. In the days and weeks that followed that first violent day of protest, weekend picketing in front of Hamtramck shops and at metropolitan Detroit meat packaging plants continued, and it spread rapidly through neighboring towns and other Midwestern cities. Within days of the first Hamtramck picket, Detroit area women's activist groups chose programs of activism in direct response to what the Hamtramck housewives did. Some women groups threatened to use Hamtramck tactics, while others sought to distance themselves from the Hamtramck women by signing pledges not to buy meat, rather than picketing. The Hamtramck women's initial performance also followed them to their rise to national renown and onto the political stages of Washington, D.C. By deciding to prioritize the goal of lower meat prices, these women positioned themselves and their cause in direct relation to their husbands' needs. In theatrical and rhetorical ways, the Hamtramck protesters framed the absence of meat on their tables as a threat to the ability of their mostly unemployed husbands to find work. In giving critical attention to meat as the contested object and its connection to the cultural figure of housewife, it becomes clear that the moral arguments lodged by the Hamtramck Women's Committee did not only or principally rely on humanitarian discourse, evoked through the vulnerability of the mother figure. Rather, by using housewife, they turned to the producerist ethic. This is not to suggest that these women's own needs or those of their children did not motivate the women, but that these activists recognize the currency of producerism. They recognize the idea that the best citizen produces a commodity that benefits the nation's economy. Their men were workers, and the men needed meat to perform at an optimal capacity. Further, while these women may have desired meat for themselves, they could not make a rights claim to meat because meat was considered indispensable to men only. Gender norms dictated that women's activism should exist in service of the domestic and public patriarchy, and in numerous historical periods it compelled it. From many Americans' perspectives, these extraordinary meat prices compounded the problem of restoring economic and gender stability. Relief personnel, dietitians, social workers, and housewives were concerned with the Depression's detriment to health, particularly in relation to men's ability to work. In Polish American households, meat was extremely important. Under stable economic circumstances, meat was eaten at every meal because it was believed to be, quote, the most essential food. A child raised without a sufficient quantity of it would be frail, and a man could not do a proper day's work if he did not have enough meat, end quote. Meat's necessity to working men was not merely articulated as the motivation for the Hamtramck boycott, it actually determined the picketing schedule. The Hamtramck Women's Committee chose to begin their picketing on a Saturday, stop picketing and boycotting during the week, and resume picketing each Friday and Saturday because, according to one of the protesters, the men do not have to go to work the next day and can get along without meat. Women's conscious structuring and scheduling of their boycott around men's needs staged what we might call a housewife's dilemma, because the term denotes both the difficulty in choosing an action, giving the sacrifice involved in all the options, and the need to choose due to the compelling force of the circumstances. The Hamtramck women faced a true dilemma. They had to buy meat because their husbands' abilities to work or find work depended on it in their minds. Yet, they could not afford to buy meat, or at least they couldn't do it sustainably, given its cost and their husband's unemployment. Recognition of housewives' obligations and the extraordinary economic circumstance of the moment went a long way to allowing this women's activism. But these factors did not give women license to ignore gendered norms of behavior. National media sensationalized the violence that broke out between the women and the shoppers as a battle of the sexes. The New York Times ran AP coverage, and this is over up in that corner right there is the New York Times. The New York Times ran AP coverage of the protest under the shocking headline, "Buyers Trampled by Meat Strikers, Women Picket Butcher Shops in Detroit Suburb, Slap, Scratch, Pull Hair, Men Are Chief Victims." Poor men. I know, I feel bad for them. Such reports titillate with the rich description of the distinctly feminine violence unleashed on the men. The Los Angeles Times report on the Hamtramck violence included a quote attributed to one of the victims that encapsulates men's diminishment of these women's very radical act. He says, "I wouldn't let Joe Louis muss me up the way some of these women did, but what can you do to a woman when she starts in on you?" The national momentum of the housewives movement pressured corporations and the federal government into defending their policies to the women. By the second week of August 1935, the Hamtramck Women's Committee had collected enough donations to send a delegation to Washington, D.C. to meet with agricultural adjustment officials in order to hold corporations accountable for the AAA processing tax. On August 20th, 1935, the Washington Post ran a story titled, Secretary Wallace flees food strikers' plea for slash. Feminine logic too much for secretary as group cites high prices. The Los Angeles Times mocked the assertion that the secretary had said he left to take a phone call. The news was that Wallace was a coward. The coincidence of Secretary Henry Wallace's authorization of the emergency pig slaughter, the Hamtramck Women's Committee goals, and Disney's silly symphonies, their particular one called The Three Little Pigs from 1933 and The Big Bad Wolf from 1934, then facilitated a parody of Secretary Wallace's meeting with the leader of the Hamtramck women, Mary Zook, when he ran out. So visually and narratively, Newsweek caricatured Wallace as the Big Bad Wolf in an article titled Meat. Women want the big bad AAA to let the little pigs alone. And I couldn't get the picture up for you. I'll send it along to the group because it's delightful. So the article covers how the 5-foot housewife, Mary Zook, bested Wallace in their debate. An image of Wallace is placed next to this tiny little woman, and he's laughing. The picture clearly is not of him in that moment, but it's recoded. If you can picture in your mind the Disney Big Bad Wolf, right? It's pictured so that his teeth become these sort of like he's gnashing and baring them, and his hair sort of sticks on end like a wolf's crown. And so he's depicted as naturally out of proportion, right? He's a wolf in Washington. And indeed, Newsweek uses that photograph to evidence that the article isn't actually a caricature, but that Wallace is betraying his real nature. That is, it casts his programs, the AAA, as an excessive response to the economic crisis. Despite ongoing criticism of and protests against the agricultural adjustment programs, by 1939, 78% of farms had contracts with the federal government. Many of them didn't have a choice. The AAA's part in helping speed mechanization on farms, raise prices, and create more profitable farms had dire effects on migrant laborers and sharecroppers. Although the AAA tried to safeguard against the evictions of sharecroppers from large farming enterprises, because acreage was removed from cultivation, fewer laborers were needed to work the land. Compounding the problem, farm owners or managing landlords oversaw AAA contracts at the local level, rendering federal protections for mostly African American laborers largely ineffectual. In 1939, when the agricultural adjustment programs were fully institutionalized, Missouri sharecropper families occupied national headlines, protesting because the AAA incentivized plantation owners to evict them. AAA had failed to protect citizens' rights to earn a living. For 5 days, through January snow and rain, in 13 camps along 38 miles of Missouri's Highway 60 and 70 miles of Missouri's Highway 61, 1,300 women, men, and children squatted in protest of their dislocation. These sharecropper families, the majority of whom were African Americans, though there were also white croppers on the highways with them, were surrounded by what appeared to be all their worldly possessions. So these photographs, I'm sorry they're not captioned. This is an image of them right on one of the highways. I don't know if it's 60 or 61, but they all gathered there under the cover of darkness, and they gathered in January because on cotton plantations, and many other types of large farms, the agreement with sharecroppers was annual. So what would happen is the employment was seasonal, but you could live on the farm in cropper housing, these little shanties, which were just disease-ridden and terrible. But you could live there. And so you could live while you weren't working, and then, of course, the landowner or the landlord would take it out of your rent, out of your share of the crop. Once you farmed the crop, that's how you would pay your rent. And you were inevitably in debt, in perpetual debt to this person exploiting your labor. But every January, they would renegotiate agreements, okay? And so sometimes the sharecroppers would leave, or they would shift, what was called shifting, to another farm. You've heard, oh, you're a shiftless, no good, yes? So shifting is based upon that shifting is part of that, okay? So they would say that croppers were shiftless because they left the farm to escape what they owed me, okay? But it was this small sort of movement just for life preservation, and they would often just go to another farm for an equally or slightly better arrangement. So every January this would happen. And so what happened was, because there were fears of bodily harm, the croppers orchestrated this move to the highways over the course of months. And on the last day of grace, which was January 10th, which is when they would have been evicted, that's when they all appeared. So they took all of their belongings. And there were a few makeshift shelters that they assembled to protect themselves. Oh, the other thing I want to say is these images were taken by Farm Security Administration officials who were sent to investigate the incident. Most croppers, though some had makeshift shelters, lived on the roadsides with all of their domestic objects, dolls, furniture, books, pans, occupied the same spaces as trucks, chickens, and campfires. The scene constituted both their meager households and their dire poverty. So from January 10th to the 15th of 1939, all the sharecroppers did in protest was live on the roadsides. They engaged in the activities of daily life. They cooked the little food they had and shared it. They prayed together. The adults tended to the children. They entertained themselves by singing and talking. While this protest bore little resemblance to other radical activity of the era, its very public display of what everyday life was like for sharecroppers was an audacious performance in the midst of a Missouri and American society that believed propertied white men had the cultural right to control the lives of their white and African American workers. Sharecroppers moved to the highways because they believed that visibility of their dire living conditions was vital to attaining their goals, which was enforcement of federal protection for farm tenants under the Agricultural Adjustment Act. So those protections were there in law, but virtually unenforced in most every way. Protest leader Reverend Owen Whitfield's speech to his fellow croppers in the days before the demonstration illustrates the affective power of their staging of hunger. Quote, "If we're going to starve, let's starve out there where the people can see us." Missouri landowners, officials, and local media shared the idea that this display was powerful enough to force change in cotton farming. And so authorities in Missouri worked to get the croppers out of sight by designating the roadside protest a health menace. On January 13th, highway patrolmen and deputized men began removing the croppers. By January 15th, the highways were clear. Authorities dumped families in remote locations. Dumped them. That's not an exaggeration. They discarded croppers in abandoned churches and in barns. They removed croppers to spillway concentration camps, that's what they called them, which were guarded to, quote, keep visitors out and the campers in. Meanwhile, Missouri landowners, politicians, and local presses sought to undermine the display by claiming that it was all performance. Detractors alleged that protesters were not really sharecroppers, but transients, that they had not been evicted, and most importantly, that the croppers were not actually hungry.
Fake news.
Fake news, that's exactly what it is. Staging their protest along national highways to signal their displacement, the croppers' collective bodies as families, carrying on with their everyday activities, signified their desire to belong. By simply living on roadsides, these shiftless people offered an authentic, unsettling picture of daily life under the AAA. While the highways facilitated publicity, the encampments also played on the practical and symbolic associations of a roadside in relation to croppers' historic mobility. Typically, protest actions, marches, strikes, rallies, sit-ins overtake otherwise employed public space, right? We're going to sit in here and you can't get through your regular activities. You must suspend what's going on and bear witness. Roadsides, however, not even in the middle of the road, just on the side, roadsides lack function. At most, they enable brief periods of rest for travelers who are on their way to elsewhere. So in one sense, the choice of these roadsides became about sharecroppers staying put. Ike Tripp, like his many fellow protesters, told federal investigators that he wanted to, quote, make an honest support for my family and won't have to be moving so much. Sharecroppers claimed Missouri as their home when they reconstituted their households on the highways. By remaining in the counties where they labored but owned nothing, no land, croppers challenged the notion that they were from nowhere and belonged no place. The depiction of black and white men in a domestic framework emphasized the protest as a struggle to fulfill their role as fathers and husbands. A white man sitting next to his teenage daughter and a small girl in a filmed news interview said, "We can't make an honest, decent living at it. And that's the reason we out here on Highway 61 right today." In another newsreel, an African-American man surrounded by a woman and his 3 small children maintained, 142 families on this highway, homeless people, and the only thing they want is shelter and food and a decent place to live. These croppers situated their display as a plea for fundamental dignity, the ability to provide for their families, what the WPA was providing to so many others. Positioned in this way, the interracial unity that was exhibited by African American and white croppers, while it transgressed cultural norms, it aligned with common national demands against the Roosevelt administration. While croppers situated their hunger as the protest motivation, many of them cooked and ate during the protest. That croppers were seen eating, together with the kinds of food they consumed, established that they were really hungry. Some foods can be signs of hunger. Cultures prize certain foods as nutritious and others as decadent. This cultural assessment, as well as the racializing, gendering, and classing of foods, determines how individuals perceive consumption or the inaccess to specific foods. So, as we all know, our contemporary concerns with malnutrition and childhood obesity, a McDonald's Happy Meal signifies hunger to us on a nutritional level, right? With class and race all wrapped up in that. So what croppers were actually eating showed how very hungry their bodies were. An Associated Press report that was featured in the New York Times detailed their diets. Quote, "Some of the more provident brought cooking chickens with them, but fat pork, bread, and coffee was the fare for the majority of the refugees." On that same day, the Chicago Tribune expressed alarm over the lack of available milk for infants and children. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch questioned when promised supplies from state Social Security and AAA offices would arrive. They did so by reiterating the urgent lack of milk for infants and the waning supply of bread, fat pork, and coffee in 2 consecutive days of reporting. Though sharecroppers generally subsisted on very little and vegetables, meats, and milk were hardly ever accessible to them, when mediated through middle-class perspective, their roadside meals were humiliating and alarming experiences. While the sharecroppers' performance in January 1939 could not change the economic reality that left these men, women, and children without a viable place in agriculture, it did unsettle social givens, triggering national disgust and deep shame in Missourians. Missouri's public officials and landowners fixated on their disparagement in the press and scrambled to restore their image on the national scene as upright citizens. On January 12th, Harry S. Truman, at the time a U.S. Senator representing Missouri, read into the Senate record resolutions adopted by landowners that denounced depictions of these Missourians by the press. Missouri Governor Lloyd Stark called for an investigation into the spectacle to show that it was faked and orchestrated by communists. They and others alleged, quote, that an erroneous impression had been given and grossly exaggerated and unfavorable publicity was received by the residents of southeastern Missouri, end quote. And that, here's another quote, the press was biased and printed grossly exaggerated and unfavorable articles concerning the demonstration. These Missourians' defensive strategies and their demands for a federal investigation backfired because the investigation substantiated the repressive forces operating within cotton culture. Secretary Wallace himself failed to acknowledge fully the program's part in the AAA program's part in displacing sharecroppers. When Eleanor Roosevelt sent him a private letter about the sharecroppers' dire situation, Wallace couched their displacement in a manner similar to surplus commodities. This is what he said. Few people are aware of or appreciate the importance of basic population facts. There were in 1938 1,650,000 more people on farms than there were in 1930, in spite of the technological advance under which the farm population of 1930 would have been entirely adequate to produce for the whole population of 1938. There are few facts so fundamental to our whole economic problem of today. Mrs. Roosevelt responded, your letter on the subject of farm population and conditions among the sharecroppers is most interesting. Thank you very much. Should we be developing more industries and services? Should we practice birth control or drown the surplus population? The First Lady's Swiftian solution pointedly critiqued Wallace's articulation of the limit of the government's obligation to those who couldn't be productive citizens. The theatrical strategies used by the Missouri sharecroppers that first spurned deep humanitarian concern and then moral outrage from Eleanor Roosevelt also appeared obvious to President Roosevelt, even before the investigations were complete. He wrote an urgent memo to Secretary Wallace stating, this situation, serious as it is for the individual families and the communities in which they are located, is even more serious as a symptom of the widespread situation throughout the South. Roosevelt further instructed Wallace to have the Federal Surplus Commodities Corporation send supplies to the concentration camps, especially milk, eggs, butter, citrus fruit, meats, and cereals. Throughout 1939, powerful Missourians continued to hinder federal attempts at emergency and long-term intervention for sharecroppers, although federal support was also incremental and far too slow given the croppers' dire circumstances. Perhaps more significantly, in the months following the 1939 demonstration, the governor created a landlord-tenant committee and appointed protest leader Reverend Whitfield as the sharecropper representative to the state committee. And then when evictions loomed again in January 1940, signs along the highways reading, "Lest you forget, 1 year ago today, sat on this roadside, 1,500 croppers, shelterless for days in snow and freezing cold," promised that if evictions occurred, so too would another protest. So warned, Governor Stark called on the landlords to postpone evictions. In the face of the declining need for laborers in an increasingly mechanized agricultural industry, and with the knowledge that the federal government enacted little more than emergency relief for sharecroppers, the threat of a repeat performance was still potent enough to garner such a concession from the governor. The spectacle on Missouri's highways could not achieve transformation of the agricultural economy, but recognition constituted a radical reinterpretation of a social group previously regarded as shiftless and so culpable for their poverty. I'm going to conclude by way of going back in my timeline to 1936 to show the political importance of theatrical culture. Whereas other histories of New Deal era politics tend to disregard performances and protests as merely dramatic displays ancillary to the real politics, the archives of these protests and performances show that theatrical elements, from casting to dialogue to props to scenery, mattered to the protesters and to authorities, just as they did to the producers of the 1936 Federal Theater Project play, AAA Plowed Under. That over there is the program. They printed it to look like a newspaper. Theater offers the radical opportunity to imagine together. We don't merely see our world reflected back, but experience what the world could be like, for better or for worse. As audience, we don't just view theater, we engage with it, because a whole world is materialized, embodied, and unfolds before us, within arm's reach. This is also why a critic of the New Deal's federal funding of theater as part of the WPA wrote of this play about AAA, spending public money to educate our citizenry on a delicate political problem via the dramatic stage is revolting and impertinent. The Federal Theater Project was part of Roosevelt's Work Progress Administration. But unlike the other employment opportunities sponsored by the federal government, critics claimed that a theater program wasted taxpayer money. While tangible products of labor from the WPA, such as buildings, bridges, post office, libraries, and ditches, were considered useful and apolitical, theater was considered a luxury, at best, and at worst, a means of propaganda. Before it was defunded by congressional order in 1939 for these very reasons, the Federal Theater Project had regional operations in 22 states, produced a vast array of theater, including vaudeville, foreign language, children's, marionette, operetta, classical theater, and dance. In less than 5 years, it employed roughly 13,000 people and provided low-cost or free theater about real issues to more than 25 million Americans. One of its first plays was AAA Plowed Under. It's a kind of documentary called A Living Newspaper, which aimed to encompass the wide scope of present-day events. AAA Plowed Under depicted the 1930s agricultural crisis, the toll it took on farmers and consumers, its rebounded effects on industrial workers, and how political and economic decisions of the U.S. federal governments from World War I to the contemporary moment of 1936 had caused environmental, economic, and human disaster. Much like a newspaper, the play represented a range of stories occurring in very distant locales. A number of these scenes were of the actual protests I have just discussed, and you might say that the play predicted the sharecropper protest of 1939. What was so controversial is that this play linked discrete incidents of croppers, consumers, farmers into a meaningful whole. It asked audiences to see their world anew and imagine how connected citizens might together fix this mess. Just as the theatrical restaging of farmer, consumer, and laborer protest showed audiences their shared political, economic, and social concerns, the fact that these protests made for good dramatic material also reveals to us 1930 activists' sophisticated understanding of theatrical traditions. Protesters carefully cast themselves as housewives, dairymen, families. They selected the most potent symbols of meat, milk, hunger. They chose culturally significant sites and pronounced their contributions to the nation's well-being. These were choices made not merely for the purposes of dramatics, but they were decisions about how best to represent their cause. Today, actually a couple weeks ago, but really starting in 1915, we again see protests surrounding food in this nation, currently regarding the minimum wage hike. And I just want to end us here as we see the same sort of rhetoric of the producer ethic within these fast food worker protests. And we also see the same sort of opposition and the same connection to the food. Those who are opponents of the minimum wage hike have been quoted as saying things like, and I don't have a direct quote, like, you know, anybody can make a hamburger. The food is low, and so the workers are low. The kind of food produced, the dairymen made milk, and so that gave them a distinct cultural advantage. These workers produce hamburgers and fries and low food, and thus remain marginalized, and much like the sharecroppers, have to pronounce their humanity over and over again. So that's it. Thank you very much.
This program was recorded on March 17th, 2019 at the Ann Arbor District Library.